Jews actually ran CNN. I'm not a reflexive media bat. I don't care in one way. I'll bash the media if I feel like it. I don't have a vested interest in defending people who are doing stupid things. But the European press is obviously a different thing than the American press. Much of what you read is bias, is often just ignorance. I mean, it's a hard conflict to learn, and we don't think about the past when we report about the present enough. I think the biggest problem is that, and this is not a defense of particular Israeli tactics in the Lebanon war, what I'm about to say, but one of the big problems is that there's not enough recognition on the part of media or Western powers to understand the moral asymmetries in this conflict, and these moral asymmetries are mirrored in the conflict in Iraq, which is to say that Hezbollah seeks to maximize Israeli civilian casualties, and Israel tries to minimize Lebanese civilian casualties. That is, I don't know. I don't know a larger moral gap that exists in the world between two sides fight. You have two moral systems colliding, and one moral. It's like imagine you have two teams playing football, but one is armed with crowbars and is allowed to attack the other team during timeouts. I mean, that's so you have this situation where Israel is constrained by its own morality and by Western expectations of Western morality, and so it cannot respond to Hezbollah the way Hezbollah. I mean, it's actually astonishing to think about. And I was up north during this war, and I thought some of the Israeli bombing was stupid. I mean, I thought the whole in my whatever. I'm no military expert, but I agree with many of the Israeli commentators. Said, it was a very American-style war, an over-reliance on air power, a stop-and-start ground campaign, hesitation about casualties, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and the use of munitions that I couldn't agree with. I don't think you should drop cluster bombs on these people. But you have a situation in which, in the West, and powers in the West have not yet figured out how to fight people who are fighting with different rules. You're literally playing the same game with completely different rules. And no one. I shouldn't say no one. I mean, I think CNN was actually pretty good about pointing this out. I was with Anderson Cooper for a little while and these guys, and he would say on the air, that these Hezbollah rockets are aimed at civilians, at towns. These Hezbollah rockets are killing Arab Israelis too, and that the Israelis imperfectly are trying to avoid killing civilians. I don't know. And we can sit here as the media and condemn Israel for killing 1,000 Lebanese civilians. But what I'd like to hear more of, and that's fine, but I'd like to hear more condemnation of Hezbollah and Hamas and the Iraqi insurgency for hiding among civilians and hiding in mosques and hiding in schools and firing rockets from these places to draw an Israeli response. I mean, this is the terrible asymmetry that you're dealing with, and it would be nice to have that built into some of the coverage, at least the recognition that there's two moral systems colliding.
And my question is, that doesn't seem hard to understand to me, or to you?
It's very hard to understand. It's very hard to understand.
For professional journalists?
Yeah, it's hard to understand. I mean, because if you see a kid with his legs blown off by an Israeli bomb, that was pretty harsh. I mean, it's when you're right. Look, we have this problem. I mean, I learned this in Africa, actually. You have this terrible problem in that, well, it's not a terrible problem. It's a very American way of thinking to think that the underdog is axiomatically right. That a person who lives in a refugee camp is morally superior to a person who lives in a villa. And the person who lives in the villa is morally superior to the person who lives in the mansion. I mean, and that's fine. And that's what motivates great journalism, is to try to figure out why the afflicted are afflicted. But I'll use Rwanda as a metaphor for this. I mean, because I was there in the 95, 96 when this whole genocide was going on, and this was a remarkable genocide in that after 1 million Tutsis had been murdered, the Tutsi guerrillas managed to overthrow the genocidal Hutu government of Rwanda, which sent hundreds of thousands of Hutus running to Zaire as refugees. It was as if the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising worked. And the Jews stormed Berlin after being murdered. It was an incredible thing. And so I went to Zaire with everybody, when we saw these long, bedraggled lines of Hutu refugees with, sacks on their back, carrying their worldly possessions in their arms, the children with, flies in their eyes, the whole, you've seen the pictures a million times, unfortunately. And so all the coverage out of these refugee camps was, look at these poor refugees, look at these conditions, this is a humanitarian crisis, it's a nightmare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, wait a second. I mean, this is my reaction, and it was a very specifically Jewish reaction. Wait a second. These guys are the Nazis who lost. Now, fine, they shouldn't have, they should have clean water, and they should have food, and they should have tents, because they're people. But let's not make them out to be victims. It's like you could burn your own house down and then call yourself homeless, and that's what the Hutus did. And they burned all their neighbors out too. And so I see a little bit of that in the Middle East crisis, and so I obviously, I think the settlements have been a disaster. I mean, people who read what I've written I think the settlements are a disaster. I think the response to the first Palestinian uprising was foolish, but I think Israel corrected that by engaging in this very flawed peace process, but still trying to engage in a peace process. But you do have to ask, and apparently you can't, because it's not the accepted narrative. Sometimes you have to look at somebody who's a refugee and ask, did he do something himself, or did his forebears, or did his political leadership do something to get him into this position? And this is something that you hear very frequently among these Palestinian circles that I'm talking about.